Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have the honor to have Professor Lucas Janson from Harvard University to join our webinar as a speaker. So Lucas is an associate professor of statistics and affiliate in computer science, and he studies high-dimensional inference and statistical machine learning. Lucas is worthy of Bernoulli Society New Research Award and multiple NSF grants. And he runs the Harvard Statistical Consulting Service and supervises PhD students, advising hundreds of researchers per year. And today he's going to tell us about exact conditional independence testing and conformal inference with adaptively collected data. So welcome, Lucas.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. Really excited to share my work with you today. So, all right, this is the most important slide of my talk is my amazing student who I worked on this with, who really deserves the lion's share of the credit for this work. He's now a PhD student at Stanford, so he's just finished his first year, but he was actually an undergraduate at Harvard and worked with me on his honors thesis. This is a picture of him holding up his thesis when he won the award for best undergraduate in statistics at Harvard. So he's a really fantastic student, and you should keep an eye out for him because lots of good work is going to be coming from him soon. All right. So this is just a high-level outline. You'll see I don't have too many slides, so I'm going to sort of try and take my time on each slide and go into the details. And I think so my end time should be like 3. I should be finishing, and then. Or 3 Eastern, I should be finishing, and then there will be half an hour for questions. Yeah, okay, great. Yep, so I'm just sort of going to set things up and then talk about our general framework. And then I'm going to talk a little about simulations. There's a lot that happens in the simulations because a lot of what makes this work and what makes it challenging is actually in the implementation. So I'm going to sort of spend a reasonable amount of time on all 3 of these sections. Okay, so what is the general type of data that I'm even going to be thinking about today is what I call adaptively collected data. And there's maybe 2 broad categories that I think are most common that arise where you have adaptively collected data. The first is adaptive experimental designs. So this is where an experimenter is interested in some phenomenon and is collecting data. So, just like we would normally have an IID setup, but as they collect data, they actually change how they collect their data as based on the data they've seen so far. So, maybe they collect 5 samples, IID from the environment, and then having seen those 5 samples, they say, actually, maybe I should collect things a little bit differently for the 6th sample and the 7th sample. And then after 10 samples, again, they look at the data and they say, maybe I should collect things a little bit differently. And so this is an adaptive experimental design where the actual design of your experiment, the way that you collect your data points, depends on all the data that you've seen so far. So it's updating with time. And thus the data that you see is not IID because you're actually making new decisions, different decisions based on the data you've seen so far. As the experiment goes on. And so these arise in settings like mobile health, adaptive clinical trials, adaptive crop yield experiments. You can sort of imagine, right, that IID sampling is just a special case of this, where there is no adaptation, where you're the sort of trivial adaptation where you don't do anything. And in some settings, it can be actually very valuable to adapt. For instance, when you're considering many different possible treatments, you might want to sort of try and see from some initial data which are the most promising treatments, and then focus on the most promising treatments for most of the rest of the experiment, because otherwise, since you have so many treatments, if you just evenly distribute your samples across the different treatments, you'll have very few data points per treatment. And so I think that's a common setting where you would think about trying to do something adaptive. And again, if you're sort of very clever about how you choose your adaptive experimental design, you should never be worse off than if you just did an IID design. All right, the other large broad category of adaptively collected data comes from reinforcement learning. So this arises in online recommender systems, robotics, autonomous driving. You may have heard terms like Bandit algorithms or multi-arm bandits. This is often used in reinforcement learning. Another difference so reinforcement learning is often distinguished by an objective to maximize some sort of reward. So less about power, which is more what you would expect in an experimental design setting, and more about maximizing some reward. So in online recommender systems, you want to get as many people to click on your ads as possible, but you still may want to try and learn from the data you've collected. So you may be trying to learn what the best ad to show each person is, and you're learning that based on everything you've seen so far, and that's what makes it adaptive. But at the end of collecting a whole bunch of data, you still want to know, okay, like what types of ads worked best? If I wanted to design a new ad campaign, what types of strategies might be most effective? And so you're still interested in inference, which is what this talk is all going to be about. Another distinguishing feature in reinforcement learning, some reinforcement learning systems like robotics, they're no longer IID environments that you interact with in an adaptive way, actually Markovian environments. So in robotics, right, the action a robot takes, how it affects the robot state will depend on what state the robot was in when it took that action, right? So if its arm is at like this angle and it moves an actuator that moves its arm down, where it ends up depends on what angle it started at. Right, so it's a Markov decision process. This creates an even more complicated system because now there's not just adaptivity in the actions that are being taken, but there's also time dependence in the underlying state of the system. Okay, so this is just setting up all the kinds of problems that fit into adaptively collected data. And what are the types? So this is just notation. I'm going to have some context, which would always be the first thing you see. You're going to see the context, or it could be the state if this is an MDP or a robot. So the data comes as in you get shown a context, then you, the experimenter or the action taker, assign a treatment, which we're going to call XT, and you can look at CT in order to assign that treatment. And then after having assigned the treatment, you see a response, YT. So the system responds to XT and CT, and then that's your data point, YT, XT, CT, that triple. And then you move on to the next time point, and at the next time point, again, you're going to see the context at that time point. And then when you choose XT, you're going to see that context and also everything you've seen before. So all the YXTs you've seen before. And that's what makes this adaptive, is that you're not making decisions in a way that's IID. You're making decisions in a way that depends on both your context and all the data points you've seen so far. And then again, you pick XT and then YT is determined by the system. All right, those are our variables. And the high level goal for this talk is to perform exact post hoc inference on adaptively collected data. And I'm going to assume throughout this talk that we know the adaptive assignment algorithm, which means that the X's, the algorithm that I use as the experimenter to choose X based on the C at that time and the entire history of the data so far, I'm going to assume that that algorithm is known to me. That makes sense, of course, if this is experimental design or a robot, right? Because there's actually an algorithm that is implemented in code or something somewhere that makes the decisions as to how to choose XT. And so I think this is sort of a common setting in all of the examples I've given so far. This would be true, and we're going to take advantage of that knowledge. All right, what types of inferential tasks? I said I want to be able to perform post hoc inference. What do I mean by inference? So I'm going to focus on two types of inferential tasks. The first is conditional independence testing, which is testing hypotheses that look like this. So is Y conditionally independent of XT given the context CT? So, the simplest example of this is if G is just 0, so we can just ignore G, right? Because conditioning on 0 means nothing, right? So if I just drop G, then this is standard conditional independence testing. It says that after telling you CT, does XT tell you any more about YT? Or another way to put it is, do my actions, XT, because I'm not controlling CT, the context, do my actions, XT, have any influence on the system at all? Or am I just, wasting my time? Right, that's exactly the hypothesis that is being tested here. If we set G to 0, if we set G to something other than 0, it allows me to test a little more subtle hypotheses. For instance, if XT can take 5 different values, like I have A, B, C, D, E treatments, I might want to know, well, is treatment A any different from treatment B, right? That's the equality here, is that Y's conditional distribution given CT and treatment A, is it equal to Y's conditional distribution given CT and treatment B? And so I'm not asking a question that involves treatment C, D, and E. And so I would need to pick a G. I'm not showing you the G here, but basically with G, I can test these sort of more subtle hypotheses that pick out differences just between individual treatments, as opposed to asking for whether any treatment makes any difference at all. All right, so this is conditional independence testing. And I'll just note that if we assume something like a semi-parametric location model for Y's dependence on XT, then we can actually invert these hypothesis tests to also get confidence intervals for the magnitude of, say, differences between 2 different treatments. And so, this is another form of inference. There's nothing too fancy here. This is just using the duality between confidence intervals and hypothesis tests in nice models like location models, but it's still a semi-parametric model. Okay, so hypothesis testing and confidence intervals. I'm only going to talk about hypothesis testing for the rest of the talk because I don't do anything fancy to get the confidence interval. I just invert it. The other inferential task I'm going to talk about is conformal inference, or generating prediction intervals. And we can actually think of conformal inference as inverting a hypothesis test of stationarity. And in fact, conformal inference statistically is totally equivalent to just inverting a permutation test. Conformal inference, if you're not familiar, is a way of non-parametrically getting prediction intervals for IID data. And again, it's the statistically equivalent to inverting a permutation test where you sort of postulate a future value, then run a permutation test to sort of see whether that future value is plausible or not. And you can formulate plausibility as a hypothesis test, and you just collect all the future values for which you do not reject that hypothesis based on the permutation test. And in doing so, that set of values is a conformal prediction region, and it has exact prediction interval coverage with very, very weak assumptions. Really, the only assumptions are IID, but that's exactly the assumption that we're going to break here, right? Because we have adaptively collected data. Our data is definitely not IID, nor is it stationary or Markovian or anything like that. So we want to figure out how to do conformal inference and thus generate prediction intervals or test stationarity, which sometimes is interesting in its own right. And again, I'm only going to talk about the hypothesis test because in order to get the prediction interval, I just need to invert the hypothesis test. All right, so this is the type of data, the notation, and the hypotheses I'm going to test. Let me talk about what exists out there to do stuff like this. So notice that I haven't talked about a model. So I'm going to try to be as model-free as possible. The only thing I'm assuming is that I know the adaptive assignment algorithm A. That's how my X's are determined, but I'm not assuming anything about how the Y's or the C's are generated. And I want to avoid those. And the framework I'm going to work in is randomization testing, as the title suggests. And this is a regular randomization test. So this is not the type of randomization test we're going to do in this talk, but this is sort of a background to sort of remind us all what a randomization test is. And I'm going to build on that framework. So a randomization test says sample exchangeable copies of the data. So if my original data is D, I want to sample these D tildes, D tilde 1 through D tilde M. And I want them to be jointly exchangeable, which means that if I were to take that M+1 tuple and permute its entries, the distribution of that permuted M+1 tuple is the same as the original M+1 tuple. And because they're jointly exchangeable under the null, right? So I'm testing a null hypothesis. As long as they're jointly exchangeable under the null, this p-value, which just ranks the different data sets based on some function of them, which we would call our test statistic, S. So it takes some function of them. And what should happen is that the original data's rank among all the M+1 data sets is uniformly distributed between 1 over M+1, 2 over M+1, 3 over M+1, all the way up to M+1 over M+1, and hence is super uniform. So this would be a valid p-value. And again, this doesn't depend at all on how I choose the function S. For any test statistic, this is valid. And a special case of this that probably many of you are familiar with is just the permutation test. So a permutation test works on IID data. And when you have IID data, then the way you get these exchangeable copies is just by permuting your data set. So if you just generate uniform permutations of your data set, that's how you get your D tildes, and then you plug them in, and this is the p-value you get. That's exactly the permutation test. Super common and useful test in statistics. And so that's basically what I'm saying here is that if you have IID data, it's actually not so hard to sample these jointly exchangeable D tilde i's. And basically, once you've done that, there's almost not much left to do, right? You just have to, once you have these D tilde i's, you compute some function of them, some test statistic, and then you plug into this p-value formula. Basically, you're done, right? You have this valid test. You can play with S to try and make it more or less powerful in different scenarios, but you have this really flexible hypothesis test if you can generate these exchangeable copies D tildes. And again, that's not so hard to do if you have IID data, but if you don't have IID data, okay, so sorry, I'm saying one more thing here, which is that if you have IID data, you can sample jointly exchangeable D tildes, both for the null hypothesis of stationarity, and that's what the permutation test would result from, and from the null hypothesis of conditional independence. This would be something called the conditional randomization test, which comes from some of my prior work. I've done some work on that. But basically, either way, generating those D tilde i's is conceptually and usually computationally pretty easy to do. what have people done for adaptively collected data? So I'm going to focus on work that's been done on randomization testing for adaptively collected data. There's also some very nice work that is asymptotic and more sort of parametric in nature. I've done some work on this. Some others have done great work on this. It's sort of very different in nature in that it makes modeling assumptions that we don't make for the randomization test. It also has constraints on the types of adaptive assignment algorithms that you can use it for. And in particular, it requires those adaptive assignment algorithms to not converge too quickly to one treatment choice. And that's because they're basically all reliant on martingale central limit theorems, because you want some sort of asymptotically normal test statistic. And the adaptive data collection naturally fits into a martingale framework. And these martingale central limit theorems require there to sort of still be enough randomness in the data as you go farther down. And that means that your adaptive algorithm for choosing XT can't sort of converge too quickly. And this is not something, unfortunately, that is often the case in, for instance, Bandit algorithms, because exactly what a Bandit algorithm is trying to do is converge as quickly as possible to the best arm. So, we really worry about that assumption when applying it in real data settings where you're doing something like Bandit learning, where you're trying to find the best treatment as quickly as possible and then sample that as much as possible. That's really not going to play nice with the assumptions made by all of this martingale central limit theorem based work. And that's part of what inspired this work to move towards randomization testing. So setting aside that very interesting line of work and considering its limitations, we're going to think about randomization testing and how it's been applied to adaptively collected data. So for non-stationarity testing, right, that's the second inferential goal that I focus on. Or put another way, conformal inference, there's been some work that basically focuses on a single round of adaptivity. Meaning you collect IAD data up to a certain point, and then at that point, you can look at all that IAD data and then basically choose a new conditional data collection scheme and collect a second batch of data that was adaptive based on the first batch of data. And the second batch of data still needs to be conditional, still needs to be IAD conditional. Excuse me, the first batch of data that will make it okay. You can do this. There is some theory in particular Tibshirani et al. On sort of general conformal inference for very generally dependent data sets, but there are computational reasons that you really can't apply it to more than a single round of adaptivity. So this is a limitation in the conformal inference literature that exists, that it can't handle extensive adaptivity, which our paper is going to allow. In the conditional independence testing side of things, there is some work that allows you to test the conditional independence hypothesis with a constant G, so basically with no G, and it requires that you have a randomized data assignment algorithm because it uses the randomness in your assignment algorithm for inference. And we're going to see also that our work is not necessarily going to require that, which means that it works for a number of very important Bandit algorithms, such as the upper confidence bound algorithm. If you're familiar with Bandit's, UCB, or upper confidence bounds, is a very popular algorithm, but it's completely deterministic, meaning that given the history and your current context, the decision for XT is actually a deterministic function of those. It's not randomized. And thus, all of the existing work would actually have exactly no power in that setting, whereas our work, we're going to show in simulations later, does have power in that setting. All right, so that's sort of the background and setup. Let's talk about the weighted randomization testing that we're going to do to make up for the fact that in an adaptively collected data setting, we don't know how to get exactly exchangeable copies detailed us. So now what's changing between weighted randomization testing and the previous slide, which was just randomization testing, now our sampling comes from some Q, which I haven't told you anything about Q yet, but Q is some function, some conditional distribution given D, and I'm going to assume that each of my resamples, my detailed is IAD conditional on D, but draws from some Q that may not at all result in the D tilde as being exchangeable with D. Right, so I'm now really relaxing this requirement. I'm just saying they're drawn IAD from some conditional distribution Q. Then this is just basically defining notation. And I want to note, and the reason I put a hat on F here is that this is something that I know, because this only depends on probabilities under the adaptive assignment algorithm A. So PA, right, that's the thing I know because I'm the one determining all of these actions. And so these symbols with the tildes on them, X tilde, C tilde, H tilde, these are X, C, and H taken from the D tildes, right? So they're just the analogs of the non-tilde versions in the resampled data. And basically I can evaluate this F hat, which are just the sequence of probabilities that I would have chosen that X given the resampled data that I had seen so far. So it's basically just saying like, how weird would this realized data have been if I were running my adaptive assignment algorithm on this resampled data? And if I have those F hats, and again, I want to emphasize that I know those F hats and I can compute them generally pretty easily, right? Because I can just compute these probabilities. I needed to do that in order to compute, in order to collect my data in the first place. Then I can convert them into these weights by combining the F hats and the Qs. So the Qs here are combined in a slightly complicated way, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because that'll require getting into the math, which we definitely don't have time for. But basically, I want to look at the F hats that I assigned to each of my resampled data sets and my original data set. And I want to look at the Q probability, the probability that I would have resampled a D tilde K if my original data were given by D tilde I. So I'm looking at like a whole bunch of pairs of these, of the probability of having resampled one data set, given that I observed this other data set. So this is sort of this complicated function. The important thing is just that like we can compute this and that we know what it is. We're going to treat these as weights. And one notational thing is that the subscript of W, that mathfrak D, that just refers to the tuple of all m+1 D tildes, including the original D, which is D tilde 0. And once we have these weights, now our p-value equation looks almost the same as it was in the randomization testing setting, except now that our weights used to be 1 over m+1, which was assigning each of my indicator functions the same weight of 1 over m+1. And now it's just assigning it weight q. And note that by construction, these weights sum up to 1 because I've divided by the sum of all of them in the bottom. And so this is it. It's pretty simple. You can compute this weight function if you know the adaptive assignment algorithm for adaptively collected data. Again, I really haven't made like any assumptions here. This is what I need to be able to do. And I compute my p-value very simply as just the weighted sum of these indicator functions. And our theorem is that if F, notice this is F, not F hat, if F denotes D's density, our original data's density, then if this proportionality hypothesis holds, then P is an exactly valid p-value, meaning that basically P has a super uniform distribution, and the extent of its super uniformity is basically just determined by M and the weights, and we know those things, and so we know P's distribution exactly, so we could make it exactly uniform if we wanted, but as written here, it's a discrete p-value, and hence it's only super uniform. It sort of has a step value CDF. Okay, so what is this proportionality hypothesis, H0 proportional, that says that F hat is proportional to F? And this is basically what the rest of the talk is going to be about. How do we ensure that this holds? How do we make some basic assumptions on our data generating processes, which are still going to be very weak for modeling assumptions, but some assumptions, and how do we constrain our choice of Q? So first question, what constraints on Q ensure that this H0 proportionality holds, right? Because remember that F hat is a probability evaluated on these resampled data sets, right? So those probabilities are going to be determined by the distribution of those resampled data sets, which is determined by Q. So how do we choose Q such that H0 proportionality holds? And then once we've established those constraints such that our test is valid, now we can ask ourselves, well, which choices of Q are most powerful? And basically, these are the two questions, because there's only one tuning parameter in this procedure, which was Q. Everything else was completely determined. We just need to choose Q. And so these are the two questions. How do we choose Q such that our test is valid? It satisfies our theorem. And second, which Qs are most powerful? And I'm basically going to go into a couple examples of how to do that in two very different settings, one in each inference setting and one in two different model setups. And that'll be the rest of the talk, and I'll show some simulations as well. And that's perfect because I'm about halfway through. Okay, so first, I'm going to focus on conditional independence testing. This is my first inferential goal, right? And I'm going to consider an environment that I'm calling a stationary non-reactive environment, or more commonly, it's called a contextual Bandit environment. And like, this is a lot of words, but really I'm not saying anything fancy. It just says that the contexts are IID, and the YT, the outcome, depends only on XT and CT. So YT doesn't depend on any of the history once you've chosen your action and once it's seen the context. And furthermore, we have stationarity, which means that the conditional distribution of YT given XT and CT is not changing with time. Right, so this is a very standard setting. This is like a standard experimental design setting where the environment you're interacting with is totally IID, or you can also think of it as an IID potential outcome setting. And then, of course, which potential outcome you get to observe as the observed YT will depend on XT. So it's very much not an IID data setting. And so the adaptivity only comes from the choice of XT here. And just as a reminder, this is the hypothesis for testing, the conditional independence testing hypothesis. And just to give an example of a setting where this might arise, if you're doing online education, you can imagine that students coming to your online education portal are IID, right? They're not interacting with each other. And for each one that comes in, you assign them some sort of teaching plan, which is your treatment, XT. And you may have also some kinds of context about them, right? You might know something about their demographics, something about their like learning history, things like that. Maybe there's like a pre-assessment quiz. And then at the end of their teaching plan, you might assess their learning through some test or something like that, and you would call that YT. And then our null hypothesis is basically, are your teaching plans working? Is there any difference between your teaching plans? And in particular, if you want to sort of try incorporating one new aspect to your teaching plans, is that going to help? And if you incorporate G in some way, you could condition on certain aspects to control for things and make things a little more nuanced. But I think the high level idea hopefully is clear from this example of when you might want to ask this question. All right, and now I'm going to give away basically the rest of the answers in terms of the constraint on Q, which is one of the theorems in our paper is that the only thing that Q has to satisfy in order to ensure the proportionality hypothesis holds is that Q can't do anything except randomize the order of the data and the values of the XTs, which means that Q basically has to hold the unordered pairs of YT, CT fixed. It can reorder them and it can resample the X's, but it can't change the unordered pairs of YT, CT. That's the only constraint. So this still leaves us a lot of flexibility in Q. You can sort of imagine why this constraint has to hold. It has something to do with sufficiency, right? We're assuming basically nothing about the data generating distribution for YT and CT. And so we're basically saying, well, okay, you kind of have to hold those fixed. The thing we do know something about, which is the distribution of XT, I'm allowing you to change the XTs. And still allowing us to change the XTs and potentially the ordering of the data is going to allow us to get some very different data sets in our randomizations so that we should be able to powerfully test this hypothesis. Okay, this is a formal statement of the constraints on Q that we need, and I'm going to have a picture to give a little intuition. So we can basically pick a permutation pi, which is a permutation of the order of our data, and we can change XT to be, anything else as long as the following condition holds, which is that G of XT tilde equals G of X sub pi t. All right, so this is just this is our formal statement, but what I said in the last slide also gives the intuition for it. And here's just a picture for intuition. So the top row is a hypothetical, 3 time step data set with Y, X, C triples. And you can see here that the blue circle, which is the first data point, that gets permuted to the third circle when we go through Q. And we also change its X. Right, so the middle value is the X, 2 goes from 2 to 0, but we have to keep 0 and 7 fixed. Similarly, the green circle goes from the second data point to the first data point. The Y and the C stay fixed, 4 and -4, but XT is allowed to change. And the same thing happens with the orange oval. And here G of X is X mod 2, which is why we only allow the X to change in a way that maintains the parity of X. So it's just a very simple example, but to get a sense, what we can do is we can reshuffle the order of the data, And then we can resample the x's in such a way that maintains g of x fixed. Okay, this is our constraint on Q. Now, what kind of Qs might be good, satisfying this constraint? So once we ensure this constraint, which is not so hard, once we sort of know what the constraint is, it's pretty easy operationally to ensure that this happens, but it still gives us a lot of flexibility in how we're going to sample our new XTs and also the order. So some ideas for Q, a really simple idea, which we call imitation sub X, just samples the X tilde T, right? So our new data sets really are only just resampling the X tilde T's and the order. And this says just sample my X tilde T's conditionally on G of X in a way that imitates A. So I literally just, take my take my original data set, which looks like, YTXTCT, YTXTCT, and I just look at the first CT and I sample my ETEC XT from my algorithm, and then I observe YT, but YT is just the data, the YT I had in my original data. Then when I get to the next data point, I'm going to, again, follow my algorithm, right? I see C2, and I sample X2 according to my algorithm, and then I get Y2. Then I see C3, I sample X3 according to my algorithm. And here, as long as A is a randomized algorithm, I will get a new set of X's, right? Because there's some randomness in my A. But when A is a deterministic algorithm, this won't do me any good. It'll just give me exact copies of X, which will give me no power because all of those indicator functions in the p-value will just be equal to 1. And this actually is exactly the algorithm that the previous works on conditional independence testing for adaptively collected data. This is the algorithm that all of those papers run. And that's why they don't work for deterministic adaptive assignment algorithms. But they do have some power if you have a randomized adaptive assignment algorithm. They also weren't able to incorporate G. We allow for the incorporation of G. Now, we can think about more, maybe some more sophisticated ways of sampling. So one is to just add in a uniform permutation of the order first, and then do imitation X, right? So this is already going to give us potentially some new data sets, even if we have a deterministic adaptive assignment algorithm, right? Because we would actually see different X's if we see the data come in a different order, even when we're applying the same deterministic adaptive assignment algorithm. So that's what uniform sub pi. So that says, we're basically uniformly sampling permutations of the data, and then we're applying imitation sub X afterwards. That's what this one does. A slightly more sophisticated version is to first uniformly permute the data, but only among a restricted set of permutations that maintain the G structure, so that maintain where the G of X's stay fixed, and then sample using imitation X. Again, just follow your adaptive assignment algorithm. And the intuition behind the reason that we're always trying to sort of imitate our adaptive assignment algorithm is that we want those weights to be as sort of uniform as possible. We would like the weights to be close to 1 over n plus 1, which means we want to sample realistic data sets. We want these data sets to sort of be reasonable to have seen under our adaptive assignment algorithm, which means we want to basically follow our adaptive assignment algorithm as closely as possible, subject to the constraint that, of course, we need the data to be at least somewhat different from the original data. So we're trying to perturb the data in some way, but still make it as realistic as possible. And all three of these ideas try to follow that. We also have a fourth suggestion, which sort of doesn't separate the permutation and the X generation. It actually like intermingles them, choosing sort of the next time step and the next X one at a time, instead of first doing all the permuting and then doing all the X generation. I'm not going into too much detail on these because they're complicated, but we we have this set of 4 possible algorithms that you can use for Q, and we found that in various different simulations, actually different ones work best. So we don't have a great theory of like whether, for instance, the last one of these, which I think of as maybe being the most sophisticated, it was not actually always the most powerful algorithm. And I think that the really interesting direction for future work is to understand when these algorithms work well, when one algorithm works better than another. But basically what we found in our simulations is that we were always able to find at least one of these algorithms that was able to perform what seemed to be pretty well in absolute terms. And so here's a demonstration of that. So this is a simulation with, it's in the contextual bandit setting. We only have 3 possible treatments. And I think here we're testing whether the middle one is any different from, whether the best one is any different from the worst one. And then there's a middle arm that's sort of medium good. And so our null hypothesis is that the best arm and the worst arm are like equal. And that's what we're testing here. You can see the type 1 error is perfect. On the x-axis, we have time horizon. So this is just sort of how much data do we collect. Again, in the left-hand side, the type 1 error is perfect, no matter how big the data is. That's just a theorem, no surprises there. On the right-hand side, we see three power curves. They're all monotone increasing. That's good, because we would like to be having more power as we collect more data. The pink curve is actually a uniform IAD baseline. So this is not adaptively collected data. If we have IAD data, we know exactly how to do randomization testing. So there's really no problem there. That's the pink baseline. It's not clear that that's achievable here, right? Because we actually have different data that we're analyzing with these red and blue curves. It's not just that we're applying a different method. We actually have different data. But the pink line is sort of the best we could possibly hope for, but possibly we can't actually even hope for that. And then the red line is a non-deterministic adaptive assignment algorithm called epsilon greedy. So there's some randomization there. And here I'm applying restricted uniform pi plus imitation x. So this was the third algorithm that I presented on the previous slide. And we see that, we get decent power. It's like goes up to 75% at about 40 time steps, and then it kind of sits there. Maybe it's increasing a little bit, but it's hard to see. And then the blue curve, which is the last curve, and I think to me perhaps the most exciting, is that that's a completely deterministic adaptive assignment algorithm. That's UCB, and we see that actually its power is not so much worse than the randomized algorithm. And again, I want to emphasize that if you try to analyze the data that produced the blue curve using any of the existing results, you'd have exactly 0 power. It would be completely powerless, and that's a theorem. So the fact that we're able to get pretty good power for UCB, I think, is an exciting result, and one that really couldn't be gotten with any existing work. Something that I'll note here is that we sort of would expect that the power curves would level off for both epsilon greedy and UCB, because both of them are Bandit algorithms that are trying to do something like regret minimization, meaning they are trying to find the best arm and then always sample it. Which means that, once you've reached time 50, you probably have a pretty good idea which is the best arm, and you're just sampling that arm over and over and over, which means basically you're not getting much new information, right? Because our hypothesis is about the difference between two arms. So whichever one of those two arms is the worst arm, we're not getting any more information about it because we're basically not sampling anymore. So it sort of makes sense, because of how the data is collected, that those curves would level off. And I actually don't think that that's a problem with our method. That's an artifact of the data collection process itself. And that, of course, would not be chosen by the analyst. That would be sort of given to you. Okay, so these are our simulation results for our first example. Next, I want to talk about non-stationarity testing. So now I'm switching to the other inferential goal, non-stationarity testing, or conformal inference. I'm also going to change the data generating environment to a Markov decision process. So this is now a more complicated data generating environment, because I'm not saying the environment is IID. Now I'm saying that actually my next outcome does depend on the previous time in addition to the action I take. And I'm also going to assume that there's like no extra state here, that basically our state and our reward are the same thing. So basically all I have is I make an action, and then that results in a state. And then the next time step, I see that state from the previous time step. And this is where it's Markovian, right? Is that the next time step depends on the previous time step. I see that state as the next time step's context. I take an action, and that produces a new state, and that's my new YT, and then that becomes the next time steps context. So that's why YT equals CT plus 1. This is the hypothesis I'm testing, is that Y's conditional distribution does not depend on T. So this is basically saying, this is the same as saying YT given YT minus 1 and XT does not depend on T. And this is a hypothesis I might be interested in on its own. You could imagine, for instance, in electronic health records, maybe you're looking at patient transitions, and you hope that you've collected enough data that your patient transition should only depend on the current state, which would still make that would make this Markovian, as well as the treatment you're giving them. And then our null hypothesis is that the patient transitions don't change across time. And you might want to use this to make prediction intervals about future patient outcomes, or you might want to sort of monitor this, and if you ever start to reject the stationarity hypothesis, you might say, oh, maybe something's going wrong with my patient, I should check in. All right, and the upshot is that the constraint on Q to ensure that the proportionality hypothesis holds is that Q can do anything except randomize the order of the data in a particular way. Sorry, I said it exactly the opposite. Q cannot do anything except randomize the order of the data in a particular way. So Q can't change the unordered Y's, X's, and C's, all it can do is reorder them. And there's a constraint on how it can reorder them. And in particular, that constraint is that it must reorder them in such a way that you maintain this connection that YT still equals CT plus 1. That's basically what I'm saying here, is that you have to maintain this Markovianity that like your YT becomes the next state's context, the next time point's context. But this is basically just a constraint on permutations, and it's not too hard actually to implement to draw from the set of permutations that satisfy this constraint once you've given your data. And so as long as our Q samples permutations satisfying this constraint, we should be good to go. This is a picture of what that might look like. Again, same idea. We have 3 time points in the blue, green, and red box. And here, through our Q, which is also pi, because remember Q is doing nothing other than permuting the data points, I see that the blue box goes to the blue box, so I haven't that one didn't get permuted at all. And what's important is that the blue one ends with a 1, which means that both before and after the permutation, the next box has to start with a 1. And we see that the green box starts with a 1, and also the orange box starts with a 1. So we were allowed to permute those two. And in our permuted one, have the second box be the orange one instead of the green one. And then it was also okay that the end of the orange oval, which is a 1, matches up with the beginning of the green oval, which is a 1, right? So that's what those colors are, is that the 2 red ones align in the top and bottom, and the 2 purple ones align in the top and bottom. So this did allow us to do some permutation, and notice that the X values are different, right? So this was a non-trivial permutation. The permuted data is different from the original data. It's not like the orange and green ovals were just identical copies of each other that we permuted. All right, so we have a lot of the same ideas for sampling our sampling algorithms Q for this, which is really now we're only focused on choosing permutations pi. So the first one is you just sample time steps uniformly at random, and then you can, conceptually at least think of just doing rejection sampling so that if you ever don't satisfy the constraint, you just throw that one away and try again. There are faster ways to sample from the set of permutations uniformly conditioned on this constraint. But the point is that this is one thing you could do. We can also do it in some way that kind of imitates A, which means that you sort of choose uniformly the first time step. And then for the second time step, you sort of look at what A would have said should be the next XT that I pick. And then you try and pick from your remaining time steps in a way that sort of mimics what A would have picked. And of course, you're constrained because you can only pick from the remaining time steps and you can't change XT, but you can sort of bias towards XT that A was most likely to pick. And that'll sort of bias you towards some time steps rather than others. There's 2 more we have, which again, I don't want to go too much into the details, but basically you can do slightly more sophisticated versions of this imitation that give you a little bit more flexibility, depending on whether or not you know the actual randomness, the exogenous randomness that went into your randomized algorithm. So, anytime you have a randomized algorithm, right, there's like a random seed in there and like a uniform random variable that gets used to make each decision at each time point. If you actually know the value of that uniform random variable, you can either hold that uniform random variable fixed, or you can actually resample that uniform random variable every time you try to imitate algorithm A. And these 2 algorithms are sort of doing something slightly different there. Okay, so let's see what we get. This is now, again, I'm doing the hypothesis test of non-stationarity in an MDP. This is I think a 3-state MDP. So there's just 3 different states. And again, in pink, I have a uniform IID baseline. So that again is not an MDP. It's not clear that that pink curve should be attainable at all. In black, I have an epsilon greedy algorithm. And in blue, again, I have a deterministic algorithm. And I'm using 2 different Q generating algorithms for those 2 different ones. And we have a perhaps slightly supply. So, okay, we have exact type 1 error control, and we again have increasing power with T. Our power is actually not that far from the uniform IID baseline. And again, it's not clear that we should expect that because, again, both of these algorithms are somehow regret minimizing. What's slightly surprising is that actually the generated data, sorry, the deterministically collected data is slightly more powerful than the non-deterministic, the randomized algorithm, which is the black curve. And that has to do actually with the details of the MDP, that the deterministic one actually explores the difference between the two arms that were, explores the non-stationarity better than the epsilon greedy uniform arm. So it's not always actually going to be the case that deterministic adaptive assignment algorithms are actually harder than randomized adaptive assignment algorithms. And here again, the fact that we're able to get power with that blue curve is new because no existing methods would allow you to do that. All right, the last thing I want to mention, because I think conformal inference is most commonly used to get prediction intervals, is that we can also do this to construct prediction intervals. So this is sort of the inverted version of the previous plots, but in the contextual bandit setting. So this is back to the setting of the first example. Contextual bandit's not an MDP, but we're constructing prediction intervals. Again, we have a uniform IID baseline. We see that the average length gets to around 4 once you have enough data. The coverage is a little below nominal. That's because our inversion basically grids up the space of possible outcomes. So it's not actually an exact inversion, but of course, the finer and finer we make that grid, the more exact the inversion would be. So that's not really a concern. We would know how to fix that. It just requires a bit more computation. Statistically, there's no issue. And then we see both the blue and yellow curves. Again, blue is a deterministic algorithm. Yellow is a randomized algorithm, are achieving average length that's pretty close to the uniform IID baseline. So, an average length of 5 by the end, as opposed to the uniform IID baseline getting average length of 4 and are achieving good coverage. So this is sort of what we would like. Let's see, yes, good. I still have time for this last slide, which is that, so one thing I'd mentioned is that in order to invert these hypothesis tests to get confidence intervals, the way that I do that is basically I have to run a hypothesis test for every single possible value that I want to consider in the confidence interval and determine whether it's accepted or rejected. And this is kind of computationally cumbersome. And in particular, for conformal inference, we can actually do something a little more clever. So first, I'm going to run through the sort of naive way to invert our hypothesis test to do conformal inference, which is to consider any possible little y in the sample space of capital Y. So y's, remember, are our outcomes. They have some sample space. That's what's math cal y here. And little y, I'm going to consider for each possible value in that. Or if it's a continuous space, I'm going to sort of grid that up. Then I'm going to pretend that capital D sub little y, which is sort of my original data set, is my observed data set. And what that data set looks like is all of my data points, except that my data set doesn't include the last y, right? Because that's what I'm trying to predict. So my data set is missing that last y. So I'm going to impute with that last y the value little y. And that's why D has a subscript little y, is because the data set depends on little y as the imputed value of y for the last data point. So I'm going to pretend that this is my observed data set, and then I'm going to just run my algorithm. So I'm going to generate my resamples from Q, and I'm going to compute a p-value. Again, all of this is specific to the value of little y. Using my resamples, I'm going to determine if y is in the acceptance region or not. And that's basically, that's it, right? So if my p-value is below 5%, then it's not going to be in my prediction interval. If it's above 5%, then it's going to be in my prediction interval. And this is how I invert this, which means that for each little y, I have to generate m resamples. And what's expensive here is generating the resamples, because we have these somewhat sophisticated algorithms for trying to generate good resamples. The way that we can improve this is to actually share samples that are generated across little y. So what this looks like is we're still going to look at for each little y, and we're still going to pretend D sub y is our observed data set. So far, nothing has changed. And okay, again, nothing has changed. I'm going to generate resamples for that little y. But the difference is I'm going to generate my p-value using actually all of the resamples for all of the little y's. Which means that if I have 100 little y's in my grid, I basically have 100 times as many resamples. So that's possibly a much more powerful test. Or thought of in a different way, I can actually only generate, say, like 10 resamples for each little y. And if I have 100 little y's, then I still have 1,000 resamples per little y to use for inference, and 1,000 is plenty, which means I'll be able to save myself quite a bit of computation. So this gives us big cost savings. And just to, so yeah, the idea is this gives us nearly a size of y factor speedup. So however fine our grid is, or however many points there are in math.cal y, we're going to get a speedup of that amount. And I have a plot. I think I actually have time. So I'll come back to the conclusion. No, oh, I don't have a plot in the appendix. Never mind. I have a plot to demonstrate.
Go ahead, Lucas. You have like 10 more minutes because we started at 2:05. So you can go till 3:05 if you want.
Yes, and I would, except that I'm remembering a different version of this talk because I don't have the slide I was thinking of in my appendix. So
Okay.
Yeah, there's nothing but references. So I think I'll just go to my conclusion. And if there's questions about it, I'm happy to go find that plot and I can pull it up. But for now, I think I'll just conclude. So the weighted randomization test is an exact inferential method for adaptively collected data. So, everything I've said so far, is guaranteed to have exact coverage or exact type 1 error in finite samples. There was nothing asymptotic, and it was also, highly non-parametric. I really assumed almost nothing beyond like Markovianity or IID-ness of the environment. I didn't assume anything about like the distribution of Y or the context. The only thing I assumed was that I knew the adaptive assignment algorithm. And it allows us to test a number of conditional independence and non-stationarity hypotheses that were previously not able to be tested on adaptively collected data, and also to invert these to get confidence and prediction intervals. Can handle a number of different adaptive environments, so both IID environments that you're interacting with adaptively, but also MDPs, and it can handle, importantly, deterministic adaptive assignment algorithms. And I think that's a big new thing about this work that really wasn't possible to do with any other works like at all. I mean, they just didn't apply, or they had no power. What was really hard here, in order to get this to work, was to come up with good choices of Q. And basically, good choices of Q have to trade off two things. So we want our Q values to be close to exchangeable, right? In a perfect world, we would just do the original randomization test, right? The vanilla randomization test that I mentioned, in my third slide, not the weighted randomization test, because the original randomization test is just the weighted randomization test with weights equal to 1/n+1, and that's a great test. We know that that's good. The weights aren't helping us in terms of power. They're just allowing us to still get a valid p-value when we can't sample exchangeably. So in a perfect world, we would get things as close to exchangeable as possible, or perfectly exchangeable. But one way to do this, for instance, would be to just have our Q spit out copies of the original data, right? So if it just spat out m copies of the original data, then all of our resamples would be perfectly exchangeable with the real data, right? So it would be perfectly exchangeable. However, there would be no diversity. And that's the second sub-bullet point, is that we need our samples to be close to exchangeable, and we want them to be diverse. So they need to be different from the original data and different from each other. They need to somehow search out the space of possible data sets you could have seen without moving too far out into the bounds of being sort of very far from exchangeable, very, very unlikely to have been observed under the real data generating process. So these two sort of fight against each other, because we can also easily generate resamples that are highly, highly diverse if we just, sample totally weird data sets, right? We can sample them however we want, but then they won't be close to exchangeable. They'll be very unlikely to have been observed on the original data generating process. Those resamples then will get very, very small weights, and they really won't help our inference much, right? If you just sample 100 resamples, all of which have weight, 1/1000, well, then basically all the weight goes on the original data point. And the original data point, when you compare it to itself in the p-value, the indicator value is 1, because its test statistic is, of course, less than or equal to its own test statistic. And so you're going to end up with a p-value that's still very big, because you really, to get that p-value down, you need diverse and close to exchangeable samples to show that the data could have been different under the null hypothesis. And then lastly, computationally efficient inversion of tests to get intervals. This was a challenge, one that I think we have a pretty nice solution for conformal, in the sense that we can at least significantly speed up this process, although it's still not totally trivial. We don't really have any tricks for inverting the conditional independence test in a semi-parametric location model to get confidence intervals. Unfortunately, the same trick doesn't work, and that's still a challenge. Generally, for confidence intervals, right, it's one dimension. So you're doing something over a one-dimensional grid, which is hopefully not too burdensome, but it would still be nice if we could figure out a better way to do that. So these are the two main challenges, and I think I'll end there. We're right about at 3, which is what I was aiming for, although good to know I could have gone to 3:05. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucas. And let me stop recording and move to the Q&A session.